This video is a part of a series created in collaboration with the George C. Marshall International Center about George Catlett Marshall Jr. and his home, Dodona Manor. The George C. Marshall International Center brings to life the timeless values of selfless service and unwavering integrity to develop visionary leaders worldwide. Learn more about Dodona Manor, view upcoming events, and join the mission to preserve Marshall's legacy at georgecmarshall.org.
So you have a PhD in human cognition?
In information technology is the title on the degree, and my field of study was human cognition.
What part of human cognition specifically? Was it like
Specifically, it was situational awareness. And so how do you know people are situationally aware, and can you actually quantify situational awareness?
That would be interesting. If we ever do like another podcast, that would be really fast.
Okay. There's a guy that has a theory that there is such a thing as a continuum of cognition that runs from intuitive cognition on one end to analytical cognition on the other end. And I took some exception to that. And I thought that, so I looked at his experiment that he conducted before to demonstrate it. He came up with the theory, and then he demonstrated it at his own experiment. I'm always a little bit suspect of people that design their own experiment and then it comes out the way they want. I'm always a little suspect by that. There was a second experiment done in University of Georgia, but it was done with a pool of psychology students, which I think is hardly a representative sample. So I thought I would try it myself with using his metrics, but at the same time using experienced judges from teachers, from the ranks of teachers. And to my surprise, following his basic methodology, I made a couple of additions to it, but basically his. What I found was that my evidence supported his theory. So in contrast to what I was expecting, which was that I would disprove it, or at least falsify it, I was unable to do that. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And I've still been interested in the topic, although I haven't revisited it since my PhD. But I would like to revisit. I think about it quite a bit, how cognition works in the human brain and when it began. I do a lot of reading on evolutionary psychology and how we went from great apes to Homo sapiens. And
so you're more into like not only how people think, but like how they react in certain situations.
Yes, his basic premise is that if the cognition type matches the task at hand, if it's an intuitive task, then intuitive cognition should do better than analytical. And if it's an analytical task, then analytical cognition should do better. And that in generally shows itself to be true. I personally still am not convinced that there is such a continuum, because in my mind, if there is a continuum like that, there should be some physical manifestation that changes as you go from here to here, such as if you look at the electromagnetic spectrum, for example, it's the frequency of the light that's being examined that changes as you go from one end of the spectrum to the other. Well, I think there should be something like that in the intuitive and analytical cognition. I haven't come up with it.
So like the energy change in analytical cognition.
Right. Now, at the time I did my experiments, which was in 2010, there was no professional writings on that subject of a physical manifestation of change. However, since that time, I've noticed that there have been 2 articles published in peer-reviewed journals that talk about
you keep talking.
Sure. Talks about the change in the glucose level within the blood is a measurable quantity that changes as your cognition type changes. And another is the dilation of the eye, the pupil of the eye.
Yeah, I heard that. That was definitely, I've heard that before.
And so it's occurred to me that if I was doing it today, I would devise my experiment a little bit differently and measure both of those things to see if there is in fact a physical manifestation of this drift along the continuum, if it is in fact a continuum. So I haven't done that. I mean, I've been busy ever since, I already had the degree, so I didn't do it. But I would love to find a PhD student that's interested in that and have them put to work on it.
Cognition is probably one of the most fascinating things that people don't think about, because some people like to escape from reality rather than try to understand why they think the way they think.
Well, situational awareness is all about reality.
Yeah, that's what sucks. Like some people want that fantasy world rather than let me actually find out who I am, rather than try to experiment with all the possibilities that I'm not.
Right. One of the interesting things in the situational awareness studies in the literature is professional airline pilots have been studying situational awareness for a very long time. And the one of the interesting things they found is that when pilots on an airplane engage the autopilot, when they're at cruising altitude and they engage in autopilot, they find that they lose situational awareness extremely fast because the automatic pilot does all of that. And then if the automatic pilot fails, they're actually worse off than if they never had one in the first place, because now they have to figure out where they are, what they're doing, what the attitude of the airplane is, what the airspeed is, what's the indication, what's the problem. So they start basically below a zero level with situational awareness once they've used an autopilot, which I thought was an interesting observation. The Army at this time was putting a Blue Force tracker, which is sort of a GPS screen inside all the combat vehicles that would show you where all the other blue or friendly vehicles were located. And so I was interested in situational awareness from that aspect. Does it improve their warfighting capability or not? I found, of course, it does. And ultimately, the Army ended up buying those and putting them in combat vehicles. And they were used very successfully in the 2003 Gulf War.
When they're on the autopilot, is that mostly that once they have that like sense of security that they start becoming complacent?
They turn off their attention.
Yeah.
So their attention to the airplane becomes much less than it is when they're actively flying. Their visual pattern changes as to what instruments that they scan. And frequently they don't scan any instruments at all, as long as there's no indication of trouble. They drink coffee and talk to each other. And so they definitely lose the awareness of what their airspeed is, what their heading is, and what their altitude and attitude are. Which is fine. That's what an automatic pilot is for. But when the automatic pilot fails, then that kind of leaves them at a significant disadvantage. So there's been talk about having one crew member, flying the airplane all the time, even when the automatic pilot's engaged, just to offset some of that. And I don't know what they do up there in that cockpit. So, but it seems like that might not be a bad idea in my mind.
What was the first thing you wanted to go over?
There's several characteristics of leaders, like we just mentioned, but there's one characteristic that I think is extremely important is the ability to speak truth to power. And George Marshall had that in spades, and I want to give 3 examples of it and kind of explain the context and the lessons that came out of his doing that. It's an example of not only moral courage, but even physical courage, and of integrity to be able to speak to your boss or to a superior of some grade and tell him things that he doesn't want to hear, or to inform him about things that he doesn't really want to know about. The first example I want to talk about was in October of 1917. It was during World War I. Marshall at this time was a captain, and he was the G3, or the operations officer for the 1st Infantry Division, which was our 1st division that we sent to France. And they were engaged in training with the French Army in order to be employed in combat for the first time. They had not yet been employed in combat. So at that time, the Army didn't have divisions. This was the very first one that was formed, and so it was called the 1st Infantry Division. General Pershing at this time was a 4-star, and he was the commander of the American Expeditionary Force, AEF, that was in France, and of which the 1st Division, of course, was a part. And so General Pershing was going to come down and watch some of the training that was taking place in France before the 1st Division was going to be committed into the line. And Marshall, of course, as the operations officer, was responsible for the training of the unit and also for setting up this particular training demonstration that took place when Pershing came to visit. And so Pershing came down, he watched a demonstration. It was some French-based training on how to live and survive in the trenches. And it didn't go particularly well. And Pershing was pretty upset by what he had seen, and he felt like that what he thought was the training was substandard based on the results of what had happened in the exercise that he watched. And so the division commander was there. All of the division staff officers were there, a division commander being a 2-star, including Captain Marshall. In fact, Captain Marshall was the junior man present. And after the exercise was over, Pershing said, assemble the officers. So they assembled all the officers around General Siebert, who was the division commander. And Pershing, in Marshall's own words, gave everybody hell. And he just chewed them all up and down one side and down the other. And in particular, General Siebert, he asked him several specific and pointed questions, but Siebert wasn't able to answer. Now, Siebert was already in kind of bad form with General Pershing, and he didn't think very highly of him. But he really was outspoken in his criticisms in front of his staff officers, which is a fairly significant failure of leadership to do that. And after he got done with Siebert, he turned to the chief of staff of the division, who was a brigadier general, and who had only been there for 2 days. He had literally less than 48 hours in France, and he knew nothing about the exercise that happened. He was just there to observe it, just like Pershing was. And so when Pershing asked him a couple of questions and he wasn't able to answer anything, and Pershing became disgusted with the whole group. And so in his anger, he turned around to walk away. And Captain Marshall, as the junior man present at the assemblage.
What was Marshall's rank at the time?
Captain.
Captain, right.
So there were 7 grades between him and Pershing. So that's a lot of difference in both age and experience and in responsibilities.
But if I remember correctly, Pershing started before Marshall?
Yes, Pershing was commissioned, I think, in 1898. So he started several years before Marshall did. And Marshall felt like something had to be done and something had to be said to salvage the situation. And so despite the fact that he had just been chewed out, he reached out and grabbed General Pershing physically by the arm to prevent him from walking away. And Pershing turned around and said, "What do you have to say?" And Marshall said, "Sir, there's something that needs to be said here, and I've been here the longest, and so I think I should say it." And then he proceeded to speak for about 5 minutes on all of the different things that the 1st Division had been promised by either the French or by Pershing's own headquarters, which failed to materialize. They were responsible for providing them transportation. They were responsible for providing ammunition, because the American Army didn't have any of those things when it went to France. They were responsible for providing instruction. There was supposed to be a standard operating procedure for how a unit operates in the trenches. It was supposed to come from Pershing's own headquarters, and it had not yet been printed. So they had no standard operating procedure to go by, and they were reduced to relying on what the French told them about the war. Of course, the French have been fighting this war for several years now, and they've been bled white. So they didn't have the ammunition. They didn't have the transportation. They didn't have anything either. And so Marshall's view was that what you had just seen was the best that could be done under the circumstances. And Pershing said, "Well, you must understand." Well, first he did verify what Marshall told him. When Marshall said the SOP, for example, hadn't been published yet, Pershing turned to one of his staff that was there and asked them, "Is that so?" And the colonel said, "Yes, that was so." And so Pershing began to believe maybe Marshall was telling him the truth. And then he said, "Well, you must understand the troubles that we have as well." And he turned to go again. And Marshall stopped him a second time and said, "Yes, we have them as well, General, but every single day, but all of them have to be solved by night." And the point that I carried away from this is that, first of all, he was courageous enough to speak up. Second, he was in command of the facts of the situation, which other people did not have. That's the connection to the situational awareness that we talked about. Third, he had the courage, the moral courage and the physical courage to reach out and stop General Pershing from walking away and put himself in the line of fire in order to explain to Pershing what had happened. Now, General Pershing was a unique soldier, and he was not the kind that took criticism personally. And so when he heard all of this, he heard all of this without exploding and unloading on General Marshall a second time, or Captain Marshall at that time. And in fact, Marshall said in future visits to the 1st Division, he always asked for, "Where's Captain Marshall? I want to talk to him." And he sought him out and confided in him. Marshall, after the war was over, General Pershing became, even before the war was over, General Pershing moved Marshall from the 1st Division all the way up to the Allied Expeditionary Force, and he was the assistant operations officer there. And then after the war, General Pershing went to become the chief of staff of the Army, and he asked Marshall if he would come and be his aide. So Marshall spent 5 years as the aide to the chief of staff, which was excellent training for him when he became chief of staff himself. So that was not just a one-off incident. Another anecdote, though, before we leave it, General Marshall felt that all of his compatriots that were there on the staff felt that he had sacrificed his career in that brief 5-minute span, and they all wished him well because they said, "You're going to be fired, no doubt." And Marshall's response to that was that the way he saw it, the only thing Pershing could do would be move him into the trenches, and that's where he'd rather be anyway. So he was not the least bit perturbed by any future repercussions, but there weren't any bad repercussions. They were all good. Well, the second example that I wanted to talk about, it was in 1938, so this is almost 20 years later. At this point now, General Marshall is the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army. He's a one-star general, a very junior one-star, just been promoted to one-star. He was in Washington, and he was on the chief's staff. And the chief at that time was a four-star whose name was Malin Craig. And Marshall was one of his, he had several one-stars on his staff. Marshall was just one of them. There was a meeting in the White House. Army was still trying to get its act together in preparation for what they believed was going to be World War II when it came along. The British and the French had been fighting now for some time. The Japanese and Chinese as well had been fighting. I take that back. The British and French had not yet gone to war, but the signs were that there was war coming. President Roosevelt was involved in the budget decisions that had to be made in the Army, and he proposed in this meeting, which was held in the White House. President Roosevelt was the senior attendee. There were about a dozen people in the room, including the Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of Commerce, General Craig, of course, as Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Hap Arnold, who was the Chief of the Army Air Corps at that time, and then George Marshall, who was the Chief of War Plans. And the discussion was about the Army's budget. And Roosevelt recalled that the Army Air Corps was a part of the Army at that time, so they didn't have a separate budget. And Roosevelt was enamored with the idea of having industry produce about 10,000 airframes for use, but he was not at all in favor. In fact, he removed from the budget the money it would take to produce the crews to fly those extra 10,000 airplanes, the hangar space for them, the fuel, the maintenance facilities. None of those things he wanted to fund, only the acquisition of the airplanes itself. And he proposed all of this and then went around the room of this dozen or so senior people in the administration that were there and asked what they thought of that idea. And Marshall reports that, in fact, the reports from anybody that was in the room was that everybody was in favor of it. And as he went around the room, he said it was all smooth talking and everybody was in agreement. Yes, this was a good idea, Mr. President. And he finally got to Marshall and he said, "What do you think, George?" And General Marshall is a very formal man, and he did not appreciate anybody calling him George, particularly not somebody that he had just met for the first time that day. And so he said, "I'm sorry, Mr. President, but I don't think that's a good idea at all." And he said Roosevelt had a startled look upon his face. He adjourned the meeting right away. Everybody left. The same thing happened in France 20 years earlier. Everybody crowded around Marshall and said, "Well, that's the end of your career. You can kiss your star goodbye." But Marshall felt that it was important to say those things, that they required buying airplanes. He had a sneaking suspicion that Roosevelt's motive was to buy the airplanes without any of these additional support packages, solely so that we could give the airplanes to the British or to the French, which he felt was detrimental to the best interests of the United States. And that's why he didn't agree with the decision or with the proposal. As it turned out, they did budget for airplanes, but they reduced the number of airplanes and budgeted for crews, maintenance, hangar space, and all of the support that goes with the airplanes so that they could be used by our Army rather than given off to the British or to the French. So that was the second instance. And again, as with Pershing, Roosevelt was able to take criticism if it was thoughtful and not personal. And in a matter of less than a year, he had promoted Marshall straight from 1-star to 4-star to become Chief of Staff of the Army himself and replace Malin Craig.
On the best day to get promoted.
On the best day to get promoted, his promotion and his assignment as Chief of Staff was on September 1st in 1939, which was the day that Hitler invaded Poland. So he began his long tenure as the Chief of Staff throughout all of World War II. The third incident that I wanted to talk about took place while he was Chief of Staff. It took place in 1943. again in November, and it was during the Cairo conference. The war effort. Now, Churchill, of course, was the prime minister and minister of defense in Britain. Roosevelt was still president, of course, and General Marshall was now chief of staff and had been for about 4 years, and had been intimately involved in organizing, equipping, and training. Now, the American theory of war is that your center of gravity is the enemy's army. And once you've defeated the army, then you can do what you will with the rest of the country. But the first center of gravity is the army itself. Churchill had an opposing view from the British side, which was they weren't strong enough to come across the Channel and attack in France, which would have been truly the center of gravity for the German army. And so but at the same time, he felt as a politician, they couldn't sit idle and do nothing while they waited to build up strength. Most of that strength, by the way, was American. So there was constant conflict where Churchill wanted to embark upon different campaigns on the periphery around Germany, nibbling at the edges, so to speak. And the Americans were bound and determined that they wanted to go across the Channel and fight the German army and defeat that, and then they could do whatever they wanted anywhere else in the world once they'd done that. Yeah. So Churchill, the situation was we had finished the invasion of Sicily, and now we're in fact in Italy, and they met. All the chiefs met in Cairo to discuss what should be our next steps. Well, this conflict, of course, emerged almost immediately, where Churchill wanted to invade the island of Rhodes, which is a small island southeast of Greece in the Mediterranean, very close to the Turkish border. And there was a German detachment there. He wanted to take Rhodes and use it as an airfield to get Turkey into the war on our side. And Marshall felt very strongly that any diversion of resources to such a sideshow as the island of Rhodes was not something he wanted to do. And he instead wanted to continue to build up the forces in Great Britain as quickly as possible so that we could do a cross-channel invasion. In fact, he wanted to do a cross-channel invasion in 43 and had to postpone it into 44. And he saw this Rhodes adventure as just being a way to accomplish basically nothing. And so Churchill was insistent and Marshall was insistent. And finally, they convened the meeting of all of the combined chiefs of staff, so all the chiefs of staff from the American forces and all the chiefs of staff of the British forces, with Churchill and Marshall, of course, present. And finally, Marshall said to the assembled group, "Far be it from me to dictate, but there will not be one goddamned American soldier die on that beach in Rhodes." And there was a stunned silence in the room. Nobody had ever talked to the prime minister like that, certainly not the British chiefs of staff. But Churchill accepted defeat graciously. He didn't have enough forces in the British army to do that himself, so he accepted defeat, and the Rhodes operation never was carried out. But that's another example of Marshall having the courage to speak what ultimately became how the best to use the American army. It's a dynamic people tend not to think about, but the dynamic between the British, who started the war in September 39 before we did, fought alone. I think in Churchill's memoirs, he describes it, how Britain fought alone with hardship as their garment, while the rest of the world, those who were half blind became half ready, or something along those lines. And then when the Americans did join the war after Pearl Harbor in 1941, then slowly but surely, the Americans built up a preponderance of the combat power, a preponderance of the men, the equipment, the tanks, artillery, the ammunition that was going to be used to prosecute the war. And the British share of the war decreased at the same time. And that was a hard pill to swallow for the British Empire, that they were being essentially marginalized in the conduct of the war that they had not only been in from the beginning, but had fought alone for a long time.
Yeah, so it's almost like the British started the war and Marshall wanted to end it.
Well, he did. He wanted to end it, and quickly. The quickest way is something General Grant proved in the Civil War, is to seize the enemy's army. Once you've destroyed that, that's the center of gravity. Then you can do anything you want with the territory. You can go anywhere you want. You can open up waterways and ports. You can do anything. But the first objective is to destroy the enemy's army. That's always been the American way since the Civil War.
Yeah. Was it sort of like Churchill wanted to have a show, whereas Marshall wanted to have results?
Yes, and that's exactly right. And Churchill, as a politician, nobody's evil in all of this. Churchill, as a politician, required the British Army to do something. He said, the forces of the king cannot stand idle. Muskets must flame, I think was his exact expression. They have to do something to show to the public, the British public, who were suffering, particularly from air attack, that the British forces were not idle, and they were, in fact, all the forces of the empire were, in fact, fighting somewhere. And he had strategic reasons for picking Rhodes. It wasn't just some island. He wanted an airfield. Much of World War II was all about airfields, particularly in the Pacific.
So from Churchill's perspective, he wanted a good victory that'll boost the morale of the people?
A good victory, but also a demonstration that they were, in fact, contributing to the war effort, that they weren't, the British population was simply not being forced to suffer air bombardment, and nothing was being done by the armed forces of the empire. That was a sort of a situation he could not let evolve. And the Americans, frankly, weren't ready. They weren't trained. We didn't have enough to go across the channel, although we wanted to not till June of 44. And even then when we did, then again, the British contribution began to shrink and continued to shrink. There was a point, I want to say it was in July or August of 44, when the Americans on the continent outnumbered the British. And so that's when the balance shifted. And Churchill suddenly realized that he was perhaps not running this war anymore, and perhaps it was being run out of Washington.
Yeah. What you were saying about both Pershing and Roosevelt, the first two examples you give, for both situations, it sounded like the people, the subordinates were very eager to please.
Yeah.
To want the perception that they're doing a good thing, that they're agreeing with the authority rather than really digging into the actual situation and getting the problem solved. And then also the authorities having the perception of circumstances that what they think should happen and what is happening are two different things.
Yes, and particularly the first part of that is sort of an ugly aspect of this lesson, that all the other people in that room should have been able to speak up and should have known better. In the case of the first example, perhaps the chief and the chief of staff of the division and the division commander both were largely unaware of what had gone on, and so they were really not in a position to defend themselves. But in the second example in Washington in 1938, certainly the chief of staff of the Army should have been able to make the same point without having his deputy chief of staff step in for him. And it's a very, in my opinion, this is my experience in the world, that the higher up you go in the chain of command, the more responsibilities you have, and the harder it is to discover the truth, because people have a tendency to tell you what you want to hear. And that has to be actively fought by a leader at a high level. You have to really fight to get the truth, and not just what people want to tell you. They're trying to please you, and so if you want to know the truth of what's going on, that's one reason management by wandering around is a term that I've heard a great deal, where you go out into the field to the front and see what's happening with your own eyes so that you can have a better appreciation. You can really fall into a very pleasant kind of an information coma at the high levels of your, government, if nobody will come in here and tell you what the actual truth is. So a man that will tell you the truth, even if it's unpleasant, is a very valuable thing to have on your staff. I think Roosevelt and Pershing both saw that, and that's why they kept him on rather than firing him.
When you're talking about Pershing, about how he was angry about the situation, about all the things that were happening, but also why it still was happening.
Why it wasn't right?
Yeah, why it wasn't right. In a way, is both the fear and the disgust and the anger part of the problem of him like putting up not a wall, but kind of putting like a facade in front of him that like this is.
You have to understand, in my mind, you have to understand the pressures that each of these men are under, and they're under very different circumstances, and they act according to their own best interest in each of those circumstances. Pershing has been named as the head of the American or Allied Expeditionary Force. He is responsible for the execution of the American Army in France when they fight. it was Pershing's, actually it was our president's decision that Pershing had to follow through with, to employ the American Army as an independent unit by itself. The British and the French wanted to break our army up into battalions and shove them into British and French divisions and just use them as a manpower resource rather than to fight as an army as a whole. Pershing had very strict instructions from the White House that was not to be the case. The American Army would fight as an American Army as a whole. We would plug any hole in the line you want, but we're going to be an integral American Army.
We're fighting alongside, not...
Precisely. We are not merely manpower replacements for you guys. So Pershing had that pressure on him. This was the first time since the Spanish-American War that the American Army had gone overseas to fight. The American Army, since the Spanish-American War, had deteriorated a great deal.
The Spanish-American War was late?
1898.
Okay.
And this was the first case where the American Army had gone over. We had no division headquarters when the Army began. We were only a collection of regiments. And so we had to put together 3 regiments in each division to create a division headquarters, give it an artillery unit for support, and then train them as a unit. That none of that had happened in the United States before they went to war in France. It all had to be done on the fly. Meanwhile, of course, the American Army, so Pershing has the pressure of that. He has this brand new, untested, untried organization full of green soldiers that he has to meld together into an active fighting force in France, in war. It's like trying to paint a train while it's moving. And then on top of that, he's got the American people back at home wanting to know where is their army, what's it doing, when is it going to fight, when are we going to win this war so they can come back home again. So there's a lot of pressure from the home front for the army to perform, to be put into combat, to be put into the line, and yet they weren't ready, they weren't trained. It would have been murder to put them in the line against German troops. So he had a lot of pressures on him as well. And coming down to the 1st Division to watch a training exercise that he had every reason to expect would go well, and it didn't, made him question whether or not the training that they were being given was good. So he had a lot of pressures under him as well.
Does that have to do, like, if you take society as a whole, want things done immediately, as soon as possible?
Yes.
And with, like, all sense of urgency that, like, it should have been done yesterday?
We have a tendency, and Americans in particular have a tendency to be in a hurry. It's astonishing just in my own lifetime to see the shortened reaction time that we expect. It used to be we communicated by letter, and so you write a letter and a week later you'd get a response and you were happy with that. Now it's instantaneous. If it's not a text, then it's too late to be of any good.
Does that have to do with now there's a lot more convenient communication?
Yes, absolutely. The communications is very convenient until it isn't. And then, for example, my grandson is a soldier, just finished basic training. So here's a kid that's grown up. He's 20 years old. He's grown up and he's had a cell phone ever since, he's been able to talk. And sending a text and communicating with his buddies while he was in high school, very easy and trivial. They could text out messages in their pocket if they wanted to. And then you go off to basic training and they take your phone away from you. Now the only thing you can do is write a letter. And that takes, 4 days to get to where it's going. And then another 4 days to get a response back if you're lucky. And so writing to his grandfather or writing to his mother suddenly becomes a very slow form of communications, which to me was perfectly normal. That's how we communicated in our day, and so I didn't see any problem with it. But he was just appalled at how long things took. So we've become very attuned to instant gratification, which is not necessarily good.
I think there's a massive difference between the 40s and today. Is that constant want for instant gratification, just because...
I'll give you a counterexample that I ran across, which was interesting to me to see. There was an exchange of message traffic between Eisenhower, Marshall, Churchill, and Stalin during the end of the war in about April of 45. Eisenhower sent a message off to Stalin asking where the Russians were to communicate. Churchill took offense at that because he was communicating with a head of state rather than the commander of an army, and he didn't think that a theater commander should talk to a head of state. That should be done by another head of state. The whole matter had to go back to Washington, to Marshall, to be adjudicated, and then he sent his message of support. But it all took place in about 3 days, which is sort of astonishing. I mean, it's all radio transmissions. And I was surprised at how quickly the thing blew up and then blew over. in just a matter of about 3 days. Now, that was, very senior secure communications for people who were running a worldwide war. I guess that stands to reason, but the people that lived, in mom and pop America certainly couldn't communicate that quickly.
Yeah. It sounds really similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think, if I remember correctly, was it Kennedy during the...
Yes, Kennedy was the president during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Khrushchev was the premier in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and then everything was about to blow up, and then one phone call and it ended, or pretty much ended all of it.
Well, what ended it was the Russian ships with the missiles on them turned around. Okay, so that was what ended it. But the threat was that we'll put missiles in Turkey if you put missiles in Cuba. And we clearly had the ability to do that. And so shortly thereafter, the missiles in Turkey came out. So it was a kind of a trade quid pro quo. When I was a student at the Armor Advanced Course back in 1980, there were one of the blocks of instructions was on communications. And there was a quote that they had hanging on the wall that was from General Omar Bradley. He said that Congress makes you a general, but communications makes you a commander. And I've always just remembered that. You can't command if you can't communicate. And if you don't know the basics of situational awareness, like where are your people and what are they doing, then you're no longer in command. You're merely an observer of what's going on in the unit. So the communications is critical.
Yeah. What about when there's miscommunication, but you're not aware of that miscommunication?
Very deadly situations can erupt if you're not aware of it. Just again, as an example, the same message traffic that Eisenhower sent to Stalin that day said that the forces of Montgomery were going to be clearing the ports in the northern flank of the army. But when it was transmitted to the British, they were encoded and then transmitted. The encoder screwed up the message, and it said that the Montgomery's army group would be doing patrol tasks, which is very minimal. And of course, that wasn't what was intended, and it wasn't what Eisenhower sent, but he did not know that error was made. And so when Churchill, of course, got that message and believed that they were relegating the entire British army to mere patrolling on the northern flank, and he became irate. And so there was a serious miscommunication that had to be unscrewed once Eisenhower figured it out. Once they read the message to him and he realized that this had been mistranslated or miscoded, encoded.
You said that in one of the things you sent me, so I was like...
Yeah, that was an example from that Eisenhower and Marshall paper.
There was one thing that you said in the first... I think it was the first thing that you said, that the problem had to be solved by night.
That was a quote from Marshall. That was his quote. That yes, he said, I think if you push that little black button hanging off the fireplace over there, you'll get the exact recording. But because we play it as a part of the house tour here in Dodona Manor. But what he said was, yes, again, General, but we have many a day and every one of them has to be solved by night. And I don't think Pershing perhaps realized the urgency of the problem solving that was taking place, 3 and 4 and 5 levels down below him.
And the second you said that, there's a song that I know that one of the phrases in the song is, whatever you do today, you'll have to sleep with tonight. It's kind of goes back to the sense of urgency that all the problems, that you try to get as many problems as you want to get done before you go to sleep, just so it's off your docket. But at the same time, sometimes... And I guess I get your insight on this. If you overwhelm yourself, then the problems that you're trying to solve will just become half solved.
You can do more damage than good, number one. Number two, the first thing you have to do is decide which of these are important. So you have to evaluate tasks in front of you, both in terms of their importance and in terms of their urgency. And those are not the same thing. And so some tasks are urgent, but they're unimportant. And other tasks are very important, but they may not be as urgent, but they still have to be done. So before you decide how you're going to spend the, whatever it is, 80,000 seconds a day that God gives you, you have to decide what's important and then what's urgent and focus your attention on those things. If you can't do that, then and I'm talking about just generally, people in general, then you will find yourself overwhelmed by the speed at which life progresses. But if you can do that, And particularly if you can do it in a chaotic situation around you, and this is what many small unit infantry people come to find out, then you'll be okay, because the things that don't get done are the less important tasks. So prioritization is a crucial skill for somebody as they develop as a leader.
You were a colonel in the Army?
I was a lieutenant colonel when I retired.
Is there anything during your experience or in your research with Marshall or any other? You're also big into Grant, right? Ulysses S. Grant?
Yes, Grant's one of my Churchill, Marshall, my father, probably my four big heroes.
Is there anything within those people, those personas, that they always had to deal with, both like the family side but also the professional side of which one's more urgent versus which one's more important?
That's a very difficult balance to strike, because it depends upon what you're doing and where you are. In the Army, in my Army life, for example, I spent a tour in Iraq. Okay, so there, my family life was relatively pushed to the back burner because I wasn't there. I was overseas. And so my wife had to handle whatever came up, whether it was good, bad, fast, slow, urgent, not urgent. She had to handle it because I simply wasn't there. However, when you are there, the Army would occasionally send us to school. For example, I went to the Armed Forces Staff College, which is a wonderful 6-month tour where I was home every night. There was no travel involved. And the workload compared to being out in the active force was relatively light. And so you just had to do a little studying at night, and that was about it. And that was a good thing. So you had to, it's a constant struggle to balance your life between what has to be done in your professional life and what has to be done in your personal life. I've heard it described as juggling multiple balls, but some of the balls are made out of glass and some of them are made out of rubber. Okay, so you got to know which ones are which and not drop a glass one. You can drop a rubber one, it'll bounce, don't worry about it, but don't drop a glass one. So it's a personal thing. Everybody has to go through it. There's no recipe for how you...
no shortcuts or anything.
No shortcuts. You got to figure out what's important, and it also changes as your life goes on. So sometimes, if you have a child, if say you have a special needs child, then suddenly your priorities will change. So it just depends upon each person individually, but they have to recognize what's glass, what's rubber.
Did you do a lot of research into Katherine Marshall?
I've done some into Katherine Marshall. She wrote a book called Together, which is a story of their life together. She was an interesting woman, she was a widow with 3 teenage children when she ran across General Marshall. They were introduced by a mutual friend at a party somewhere in Georgia. And so she became an Army wife very late in life. She had no exposure to the Army while he was coming up as a lieutenant or a captain or a major or a lieutenant colonel or any of those grades. He was a full colonel when they married, and he became a brigadier general almost immediately afterwards. So she came into being an Army wife kind of life very late, and yet did fine. So there was lots of learning on her part, and it showed a willingness on her part to learn from the people that were around her and how to be a good Army wife. So I think that was, I'm as I'm sitting here in her house, I'm a fan of Katherine Marshall. Went through a great deal of trauma and disappointment and hurt in her life. Her husband was murdered. Had 3 teenage children as a young woman, and then married General Marshall and got thrown into this Army life experience that she had no background for whatsoever. He was, obviously during the war, constantly engaged in the war. The reason that they wanted this place at Dodona Manor in the first place was as a refuge for him, so he could come and get away from the job for a little while. Her youngest son was killed on active duty during the war. Her oldest son died of a heart attack 6 months before he was due to be married. So she had a difficult life. And then General Marshall died in 1959, and she lived for another 20 years after that.
Did she live here for the
No,
remainder?
she would not come back to Dodona Manor after he passed away. They had a separate place down in Pinehurst in North Carolina, which they went to for the winter. And she stayed in Pinehurst rather than come back. She deeded this house over to her daughter, Molly, and her husband and their 5 children, and they stayed here in this house after he passed away in 59.
That's tough.
And yet she came through it all, I think, in great fashion. She's a good role model.
Is there anything you wanted to mention or any topics that...
There is something I want to bring up. I mean, probably the single most important characteristic of General Marshall in my mind, and was also shared by Churchill and by Grant, are their integrity. And so they were men who believed in the truth, and they would do whatever it took to search out and find out what the truth was. And they were men who gave their word, and you could rely upon them. The integrity of a leader, I think, is the number one characteristic that they have to have. And part of that is, and it's actually evidenced in these examples I gave today, part of that is not just to speak the truth, but to speak the whole truth, even when there's aspects of it that don't, that aren't exactly the way you would like, but you still have a requirement and obligation to tell your superiors the whole truth, not just the parts that are good.
Does that have to do with partially telling that sometimes the truth also has to require some like emotional vulnerability? Like there's some things internally that you have to be able to come to terms with when you're telling the truth, because like your personal opinions and the logical reason are both sometimes intertwined.
Marshall, somebody asked him about a personal opinion one time, a news reporter, and he said that he reserves his personal opinion, how did he phrase it? I reserve my personal feelings for Mrs. Marshall. So he divorced himself from any emotion or personal or ego-driven involvement in the decisions that he made as the chief of staff. In fact, all through his career, not just as the chief of staff. And essentially built a wall around his emotions and not let anything from the job penetrate that wall. And I think that you have to do that. And particularly a senior military officer. In your job as the chief of staff, or any senior position, people are going to get hurt in your execution of your duties. You're going to send people to where they're going to get hurt or killed. And that's a difficult thing to live with, but you have to. And so I think many of them build this kind of a wall to protect their feelings from the requirements of the job at hand. You have to subordinate your personal feelings in almost every case. So, and I think Marshall did that, and I think he was very good at it. Grant, I think, did the same thing. It was interesting to note, somebody asked Grant if there was anything in the Civil War that he regretted. And he said yes. The decision to launch the second attack at Cold Springs was a decision that he regretted. A lot of Union soldiers were killed in the second attack. It turned out to be fruitless.
Yeah. What's the context around that battle?
It was a battle in Cold Springs in Virginia. His forces were trying to penetrate a Confederate line. He'd already launched one attack against that line, and it failed, and he launched a second one, and it failed as well. But he said that was, considering the number of battles he fought and the number of engagements, that was the one thing he regretted, was the second attack at Cold Springs. Cold Harbor, not Cold Springs.
Was this like a little bit after Lincoln took McClellan out of the army and then put Grant in? Okay.
Yes, it was considerably. Well, when he took McClellan out, he didn't bring Grant in right away. He didn't bring Grant in until later in the war. It took Lincoln a long time to find a general that would actually prosecute the war the way he felt it ought to be prosecuted. And Grant's big advantage was wherever he was, he achieved results. So he was a relatively junior brigadier in the West, Tennessee, Kentucky area, and had great success there. And so he ultimately became the chief of all the Union armies. But Lincoln had a terrible time finding a general that was actually worth having.
I know this might not be, it's not like 100% related to what we're talking about here, but do you mind sharing your story of where you were on 9/11?
No, not at all.
I think it's not like the most fascinating story in the world, but it's very heartwarming.
Well, it's fascinating to me.
But yeah.
I was in London. Kathy and I were both in London. I was on a work trip. I worked for the Institute for Defense Analysis, and I was there to address a conference on situational awareness, as a matter of fact, and the Blue Force Tracker system that we talked about earlier. We were in line. We went over early, a few days before the conference began, so that we could do some sightseeing in London. Kathy had never been, and I don't think I'd only been once. And we were in line to go for a tour of the Parliament building. And the fellow in front of me It was, I want to guess, 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't terribly late. And the fellow in front of me turned around and said, "Did you hear that a plane hit the World Trade Center?" He was an American. And I said, "No." And he said, "Yeah." And he said, I remember this explicitly, he said it was a small private plane with a pilot. And I thought, that's too bad. Sucks to be him. And didn't give it another thought. And then we went into the tour, and we were going through the various different rooms in the Parliament building. And I noticed, just happenstance, I happened to notice that as we would clear out of one room and go into the next one, there was a docent there at the building who was closing and locking the doors behind us. And I knew that there were other tours during the day, and so I couldn't imagine why they would be locking the doors behind us as we went through the building. They made no announcements of any kind, and they just carried on business as usual, but they were locking the doors as we left a room. And so I thought that was puzzling, but I didn't draw any conclusions from it. I just thought it was puzzling. And so at the end of the tour, when we came out, they have large concrete pillars in the roadside that are kiosks that have newspapers, and they plant the newspaper, they open it up and tape it to the pillar so you can read it, so people can read the newspapers outside without having to go in and buy one. And I saw a photograph on one of the Pentagon, and I thought, I know about the Pentagon. So I started to read the article, and I went, holy smokes. And so then I went back to page 1 and found it was all about the planes crashing into the World Trade Center. So I realized then why they were locking the doors. They stopped the tours. After ours went through, they stopped them all for the rest of the day. And so now suddenly it made sense while they were locking the doors behind us. And I told Kathy that we had to get back to our hotel because I had to get on the phone. I had to find out what was happening. I knew many people in the Pentagon, and I needed to find out what they were doing. And at the same time, I needed to tell Ida what I was doing so I wouldn't be counted among the missing. So we were walking. We didn't take any public transportation. We were walking back to our hotel. By now, it was getting to be dark. And I remember when we got back to the hotel that the whole block that our hotel was on was blacked out. It was all dark. There were no lights of any kind. And it turned out by sheer coincidence, there was an accident in the tube station that was underneath our hotel that cut power to the whole block. And so it had nothing to do with 9/11, had nothing to do with anything, but it just happened to be at that particular time. But it didn't make me feel any better to walk into a completely black hotel that was dark. It must have been in the afternoon when we went through the Parliament building because it was dark when we came out. And in the front door of the hotel, as we came in, there were the staff that worked at the front desk. It was 3 or 4 young ladies in their 20s that were hospitality industry people that worked at Marriott that was running the hotel. And they were standing there in a little row. And as you came in the front door, they had candles, and they said they triaged us. And if you came in, they said, "Are you American?" If you're American, then they shuffled us off to the right. And that led to the lobby of the hotel where they had tables set up with a bank of telephones on the table. And they said, use these phones, call home, call whoever you want to. It's free. Don't worry about the cost. Just call whoever you need to. Talk as long as you need to. And all the Americans were in there on the phone, basically all calling home. And if you were European, when you came in, they triaged you to the left and you went into the bar. And they had the bar set up with candles, and they were offering free drinks and whoever wanted them. Nobody could go to their room because the room keys were electronic and the lights were out, so it wouldn't work. So ultimately the lights came back on and we got to go back to our room. And I got an opportunity to call people back here and tell them where we were. My daughter-in-law back in the States took on the role of being the command post in the United States. And so she coordinated all the conversations with all the children, grandchildren, and everybody so that everybody knew we were safe. And then the next morning, we had a phone call. I didn't have a cell phone, so it must have been at the hotel, from the friend of mine who had invited me to the conference to speak in the first place. And his name was Rupert Pengelly, and he was an editor for Jane's Fighting Ships, or whatever they call their company. And he was the one that had invited me in the first place. And so he said...
For the conference?
For the conference.
Okay.
And we commiserated a bit, and he said that there was a memorial service to be done in St. Paul's Cathedral in London the following day, which I believe would have been a Wednesday. I could be wrong on that, so if you don't check me. But the following day, there would be a memorial service for all Americans in London in St. Paul's, and that the Queen would be in attendance, and as well as the Prime Minister. And he suggested strongly that we go. And I said I was not in the mood to go to a service, and I didn't feel like that was something we wanted to do. I just didn't feel like I wanted to do that. And he argued with me strenuously and said, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and you need to go whether you like it or not. And so I agreed, and I talked to Kathy. She agreed. So we went to the service the following day. We walked to St. Paul's, and it was one of the most astonishing things I've ever seen. There's a YouTube video that's on it that you can look up it describes the service, but the place was absolutely packed. The streets outside were absolutely packed. They had huge speakers and a TV screen in the street outside to broadcast the ceremony so that the people outside could see it. When he came to the cathedral, again, as you went in the door, we were triaged. If you're an American, come up here, and they seated all the Americans in the front, very close to the altar in St. Paul's. And the British, anybody else got the back seats, but the Americans went up into the front. The Queen was in the center aisle. Prince Philip was there. Tony Blair, if I'm not mistaken, was the Prime Minister. I noted at one point during the service that the pew that was behind us, farther from the altar, had all the living prime ministers of England sitting in it behind us, which I was astonished at that. And then the ceremony was absolutely outstanding. The Archbishop of Canterbury gave the sermon. And then the recessional hymn at the end, when they to recede and to leave the church, the recessional hymn was the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which was pretty awe-inspiring. And I have a very vivid memory of an army colonel, a British army colonel, singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. So, yeah, it was a pretty impressive thing. So I'm glad that I went.
I'm glad I got it recorded.
We went down I had a ticket for the tube. That was a week-long pass that was going to expire because we couldn't come home, so we had to stay. And if you have to stay somewhere, London's not a bad place to do it. So at some point, I had to go down into the tube station and buy a second ticket to keep us so we could travel for the next week. And there was this fella down there in the tube station who was selling the tickets, and he was this great big old bluff Yorkshireman type guy. Looked like he weighed about 260 pounds and very gruff. And when I went up there, I explained the situation that I had a ticket that was going to expire. I needed to get a second one. It was a perfectly easy transaction. He never said anything. He just looked at me through the glass, and I gave him my ticket. He took it, and I gave him the money, and he gave me a new ticket. Never said a word. And when he was all finished and I took my ticket, I turned to leave the window, and he looked up and he said, "Give him hell, Yank." So I said, "We will." And we did.
All right, there's two things. I have World War I's Marshall, or like Marshall in World War I and his temper. Or you could do both, either one, or ethical leadership.
Sure, I'll start with the first one. Marshall said that he was a man of very high standards, and he would, when he was a younger officer, he could lose his temper. And he was counseled at one point at the end of World War I when he was a colonel, and he was not selected for promotion to brigadier general at the end of the war. And so he came back, everybody reverted back to their pre-war ranks at the end of the war. But he was counseled by his division commander that his temper was doing him in, and that he would, if he could control his temper, he just told him explicitly that was why he was not selected. And Marshall took that very much to heart and began an effort, a conscious effort to curb his temper and not to display emotion or temper in the future. And he was very successful at that. He was very it was cold. I mentioned earlier about his reserving his personal feelings for Mrs. Marshall. He was very unemotional in the conduct of his duties after that. And I think that was good advice. I mean, you should never let yourself be ruled by your emotions, and particularly in the business of the military. So I think that was good advice for him to get. He was very frank with his own advice. In many of the letters that I've seen in the Marshall Papers that he wrote, he was very frank in his writings to individuals. He wrote General Magruder one time. General Magruder wrote him to congratulate him on being made Chief of Staff, and he wrote him back and said, "Thank you very much," and explained to Magruder that Magruder almost did not get selected for Brigadier General because of his tendency to try to do everything himself instead of delegating down to his subordinates. And he was very frank in his criticism. It was just a private letter between the two of them. But I was amazed at how frankly he spoke. And Magruder took that to heart as well. And he had another case where he wrote an officer to complain about the amount of alcohol that he was drinking. And the officer immediately reformed his ways. But he was very frank in his criticisms in private. I mean, there's always a good rule and thumb to, praise in public and criticize in private. And he did that.
I don't know if it was a direct quote from Franklin, but from the John Adams HBO series. Have you seen that?
I have not.
No, it's really, it's based on...
I'm reading a biography of Adams right now, but I haven't seen it.
It's based on David McCullough's John Adams, that's a really good book.
Yes, I have read that.
Yeah, that's a good book. But I just remember from the TV show, there's, Franklin was saying that if you criticize a man in public, or if you criticize a man in private, he'll probably thank you later. If you do it in public, he probably will think that you're serious about it.
Well, I think anytime Marshall told somebody something in a letter, I think he was serious about it. So,
like if you do it in private, it's more courteous than if you do.
Absolutely, that's right. There's no advantage to be gained by insulting somebody in public. So he was very careful to mind his own temper after that.
Does Marshall's control of his temper and being able to have a much more like extroverted candor, like being able to not only be able to control your temper, but also be able to take action when Pershing or someone else of authority is clearly doesn't have enough information or doesn't have like a good enough information. Did he learn a lot of that through his time in Fort Benning when he was teaching, when eventually he got, I guess, what they call Marshall's men, and then also during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, when he was, I forgot, what was the...
He was at Vancouver. He was running a series of Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC camps during that time frame in the Great Depression, before he went to Washington in 1938. But no, I don't think he did learn that. I think he learned his approach to leadership long before that. So he was commissioned in 1902, and so he served on active duty from 1902 until, he was Chief of Staff in 1939. So that's 37 years. I think his approach to leadership was formed long before he went to Fort Benning. He wanted to go to Benning. He said in his a letter to somebody that he wanted to get his hands on Benning for a long time because he wanted to be the guy that trained infantrymen in the United States Army, and he felt that they were not being trained adequately. He felt that the course of instruction at Benning was too detailed and too oriented on developing the perfect solution to a tactical problem, when in fact it was much better to have a partial solution that was implemented quickly than it was to have the perfect solution that was implemented a week too late. So he felt that the instruction at Benning needed to be overhauled. And so when he got to Benning, that's exactly what he did. And typical of him is he first selected specific people that he wanted to come and work with him. He was very careful about who he selected to come and be a subordinate of his, both at war plans at Fort Benning before he went to the Washington area, even during the war. His one of his big strengths was to select good subordinates, because he could then leave them alone to do the job. He'd support them, but he would not tell them what to do. He brought Eisenhower up to be the head of war plans in 1941, right after Pearl Harbor. And one of the things he told Eisenhower in his entry interview is that good men are a dime a dozen. I can find good men anywhere that can do what I tell him to do. What I really want is somebody that can act independently and tell me what they've done afterwards. That's what I really want. And so, and Eisenhower took that to mean that he was free to make decisions and he was free to do what he thought was executing the chief's will. He was free to do that and then tell him afterwards what he had done. Marshall was really did not want a string of people coming up to him all day, every day, asking him to be the final authority on everything. He said, if you're going to do that, then what do I need you for?
So Marshall was really good at judging character.
Judging character and then also at managing. In other words, not micromanaging. I think Patton was the one that said famously that if you're a yes man, then one of us is redundant, and it's not me. So that they just didn't want yes men in their organization. They wanted somebody that could make decisions on their own and know that they'd be confident that they were doing what the chief would have done had he been there. So yes, a very, very good judge of character and picking the right guy to come and work for him. And that's proved over and over again by the men that he selected, brought to work both to Benning and into the War Plans Division, and then to command the armies out in the field. Those are virtually every single one of them was selected by Marshall and sent over there to do a particular job. Now, the other thing he did, which I personally like, just as an example, everybody's familiar with the cases where Patton struck an enlisted man in a hospital in Italy, or North Africa one. And Marshall, despite the pressure, refused to intercede. And Patton was a personal friend of his. They had known each other in the old Army for many years. And yet he let Eisenhower handle that as he saw fit. And in his correspondence with Eisenhower, he said frequently, you do what you think is right, and we will back you up from back here. Never giving an indication as to what Marshall thought was the right thing to do. It was Eisenhower's problem, if you will, and he had faith in Eisenhower to come up with the best solution. And he said, give no thought to, how it'll wash back here in the United States. You do what you think is right, and we'll back you up. That's very good, management of your subordinates. And it takes, not only confidence in your subordinates, but also takes a certain amount of will to withstand the heat that's going to come from that. But that was his approach for all of these sorts of issues.
How would you define character?
Well, there's aphorisms out there that would define character, but I think character is the makeup that guides your actions. So I think character is connected to actions in my mind. It cannot be something separate. Character is not just who you are. It's not just who you are inside your brain. It's who you are through your actions. And so that, to me, is a better definition of character. There's a lot of people who think they're of high character, but under pressure or in their actions don't show it. And so they're not as high character as they think. I saw a good quote one time that said, we judge other people by their actions, but we judge ourselves by our intentions. And there's probably some truth in that.
And how would you separate actions over intentions when it comes to, obviously you know what you know and how you intended to do something or how you wanted something to get done. But then when it comes to how other people wanted to do it, I guess that's just mostly communication. Just asking them what was exactly.
There's a lot of elements that go into that. So if you have a subordinate and you want to, like Marshall and Eisenhower, for example, and you want to give them the latitude to be the best person that they can be. You don't want them just to be a little mini you, and they don't want you just to be somebody who simply follows instructions, but just, stands there mute until you tell him what to do, and then he goes and does it. Even if he does it really well, that's not the point. You haven't got time as a senior manager to do that. You have to give them the freedom of action so that they can fulfill their own potential, their own destiny, if you will. and at the same time do the things that you want them to do. That's why they're your subordinate in the first place. And I think Marshall was quite good at that. Communications, of course, is a part of it, but also empathy. I mean, they have to have some ability to put yourself in the other guy's shoes and see the world through his eyes, even if it's just briefly, to see what motivates them and what makes them work. I think empathy is a quality that's necessary for a good leader.
Character is, in a way, not the only thing, but in a way, character is built on both the freedom of choice and the freedom of consequences. That you can have the freedom to choose to do what you want to do, but there's also, if you choose to do something negative, then there's also the consequences tied to that.
A recognition that there are consequences to everything that you do, and you're free to choose. We have free will. We're free to choose what it is we do, but we're not free from the consequences of what we choose. And so being able to having the intelligence to foresee ahead what are the consequences of the actions that I take, I think are important. That empathy is a part of that, because many of the actions that we take involve other people, either in their assignments or their tasks that they have to perform. So having the empathy or the ability to see it from their viewpoint, I think is an important thing for a leader.
Is that very similar to ethical leadership?
Well, yes. I mean, leadership...
Or it's a subset of ethical leadership? Or actually, what is ethical leadership?
What is ethical leadership? That's
very good way to define it before we go into that.
Ethical leadership, I think, is being able to lead an organization of people without regret over the choices that you've made. It's comprised of integrity. It's got a component of intelligence. You need to be able to figure out what it is that the organization is supposed to do, what's the right thing for it to do, as opposed to what's the expedient thing for it to do. I think that Marshall was a good example of ethical leadership, but there were many others in that particular era. I think that Eisenhower and Bradley were also ethical leaders that understood that their mission was to do the right thing, not necessarily what was easy or convenient. And particularly not what is for their personal gain. So is leadership motivated by ethical considerations? That would be a description, I guess, that I would say.
And how would you define ethics?
Well, I think I would turn to Plato. I would let Plato define ethics. That's more or less outside my bailiwick.
How would Plato define, or should I get the actual
definition? Get the book, yeah. You got Google right there.
Might as well get it as accurate as possible. Plato defines ethics as the pursuit of a good life, a life of harmony with reason, virtue, and well-ordered soul. At the core of Plato's ethics is the idea that the soul has three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. A just or ethical person is one whose reason rules, with spirit supporting reason and appetite kept in check. Virtue, especially justice, wisdom, courage, and moderation, is necessary for both personal happiness and societal harmony. The ultimate goal is to align the soul with the form of the good, an abstract, perfect standard of goodness that gives meaning to all moral values. In short, for Plato, ethics is not about rules or consequences, but about becoming a virtuous person through self-mastery and philosophical understanding.
I agree with Plato.
I guess at the same time, when it comes to like anything leadership, both internal leadership, like self-regulation, as well as external, that there is the opportunity cost, which I guess would tie into regret. The things that could have been done or didn't actually happen.
I mean, I think leadership at a high level is constantly faced with the opportunity cost, the problem of an opportunity cost. By the time problems get up to the president's desk or to the chief of staff's desk, there aren't any easy solutions left. If they were easy, somebody else would have solved it before it got up there. And so you're frequently faced with choices at those levels. I think Truman is a kind of a good example of this. You're frequently faced with problems that don't have a good solution. They only have the least bad solution. And then it becomes least bad to whom? And you have to decide based on that. And those are simply not trivial things to do. It's not easy to be a leader at that level because of that.
So at the end of the day, it's just being able to make the best decisions with what you know, what you have, and the abilities that you're able to get done, or with the skills that you have?
Well, you want to know what's the best decision for whom. That's number one. There's somebody's going to be favored and somebody's not, and so you have to decide what's morally right for the decision. You have to find out whatever you need to know to make a decision. Some people make it an art form to go refuse to make a decision until they can go get more information. And so they're constantly on the hunt for more information, but they use it as a mechanism to avoid deciding rather than to make the best decision. Time is also a part of the element. How much time do I have to make a decision? That's usually the first question a leader will ask. When you face him with a decision that has to be made, almost always, in my mind, the senior guys will say, how much time do I have? Because I can make a good decision in 30 seconds. I can make a better decision if you give me 2 days. Make a perfect decision if you give me a year. It just depends.
But not everyone has a year, and not every decision has a year.
Not every decision has that. You're right. So you have to know. So there's a lot to think about in terms of deciding. It's not a very cut and dried recipe type of an approach.
There's a lot that revolves around preparation. The more you're prepared for something, the more you can handle that in a shorter amount of time.
Right. The more prepared I am, the luckier I get. It's kind of the way to think about it. And preparation, of course, has opportunity costs too. Well, you've only got so much time. So what are you going to spend your time to do to prepare? And you can waste it, or you can use it wisely just to get the information that I need. When we were talking about the Blue Force tracker that we talked about earlier, we had kind of the developers had kind of a dichotomy about how they were going to present this information. Is it going to be a push system where information is pushed to the lower levels from above? Or is it going to be a pull system where the information is maintained in the cloud, so to speak, and when somebody down at the cutting edge wants it, they call for it. They pull it down. And we had great debates over and over again about which kind of a system you want. And ultimately, the pull system became what you want, because otherwise you will overwhelm the guy at the bottom, because the guy at the top's got so much information. He has tons of it. And yet the guy at the bottom doesn't want all of that. What he wants is 1 or 2 specific things and nothing else.
You can give someone, like if you're doing the push system, it's like a hurricane. If you do a pull system, it's like a light shower.
Right. And we developed a mission planning system at one time for aircraft, for a special operations aircraft to use in their missions. And it was a moving map display that was going to be put into the cockpit of their helicopters. And when we went down and talked to the crew chiefs about it, or the pilots, and told them what we were capable of doing, they were completely underwhelmed. And we were astonished at that, because we thought they'd love to get this kind of information. It was what's commonplace now, but in 1990 it wasn't commonplace, and it was a digital map that displayed the elevation based off of photographs, so they could see actual photographs and basically fly through it, what they were doing. So it's like Luke Skywalker in the Death Star type of thing. And they said, we don't want it. Once the engines start turning, they said, the only communications we want from anybody is to abort. If there's an abort, we want to hear that. Anything else, we don't want to hear about it. We're busy. We got our own stuff. We've planned the mission. That's what we're going to execute. So more information to them was a distraction, not something that they really wanted to have, which is the way we thought of it at the higher headquarters. Surely they'll love to have this. Well, the answer was no, they wouldn't. So that taught me a lesson about going down to the cutting edge and asking them what they think they need first. Now, as time goes on, maybe they would like it, but their first reaction was, nope, the only thing I want to hear from you is abort.
Yeah, so it's almost like you have this massive bucket as a higher up, and you get all this information all this water poured into this bucket, and over time it starts filling up, and you have this like nice accumulation of information. And if you just dump it on the subordinates, now they're like overwhelmed with it. But if you just let them get their own cups and take as much as they need.
Exactly. A pull system is almost always better, particularly for subordinates that are under stress. That it's almost always better for them. They will know what they want, and they want to be able to retrieve it quickly. That's the best you can do for them. Shoving everything down there is easy for you. That's the easier thing for you to do, but it's not the right thing to do.
Yeah, so that's where convenience is useful.
Well, and the empathy to understand their attention. Everybody's got finite attention spans. We can't absorb much more than 7 things, I guess, was Miller's famous thing, 7 plus or minus 2 or something.
There's a limit to how much we can retain at any given moment.
And they know what they want and what they think they need.
Is there anything specific that you wanted to tie it out of? Or?
No, we're going to have to take some time to put the room back together. And
even though technically this is more of a Marshall podcast, but I'll just tie it in because I do this for every podcast. What would you have told yourself, I guess in your case, maybe 20 years ago or 10 years ago? Like if you were to talk to yourself 10 years ago, what would you have told you? Or another question, who do you want to be 10 years from now?
Well, I'd like to still be me.
Yeah, well, preferably, yeah.
I'd like to be above ground. I don't know. 10 years is not a very good time span to pick. I'm 73.
Okay, 40 years ago.
40 years ago, I would have paid a lot more attention. Several things, I guess. One is don't neglect the religious aspect of your life, the religious component. I would have, if I met myself 40 years ago, I think I would have said, you need to develop the religious side of your life more than you are. So that's number one. Would have paid less attention, I think, to the conventional wisdom about how your career should go, and instead let your career develop on its own. Let it develop. There's no recipe to get to be a senior leader in the U.S. Army, and there shouldn't be. So I think I would have paid less attention to what Branch said. Go here, go here, do this, go here, do this, do that job, then do this job. I think I would have paid less attention to that. But I don't have any what I would call significant regrets about it. So
because that's just development. It's like you don't know what you don't know.
Everybody develops at a different pace. It's hard to get to understand that. When you're raising your kids, I think you sort of begin to see that probably for the first time, is that everybody develops at their own pace. It's not the same pace for everybody. And that goes for all of your family, it goes for your subordinates, it goes for your superiors, who are also still undergoing development in their own lives, even though they're your superior, they're not done developing themselves. So that's important, I guess, to keep that. Empathy is a big deal to me. I mean, being able to see the world through other people's eyes is a big change, life changer. So
cool. Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great.
Thanks for listening.
Don't worry. I've done I think probably have 1,500 minutes already of podcast stuff.
Good. Well, you must be learning a boatload of stuff.
I probably am. I'm just not retaining it.
Well, that's why you got it on film.
I know, exactly. So I don't have to remember it. No, but this is great. This was, not that I had low expectations or anything, but just I had low expectations.